Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Brain Trainer podcast, AI for Social Impact. I'm Norman Valdez, and today we're thrilled to have Renee Black with us. She is the founder of GoodBot and passionate advocate for responsible technology. Her work focuses on countering disinformation, reducing bias, establishing frameworks that project digital rights. With a rich background as the founding executive director of PeaceGeeks, intersections, technology conflict, humanitarian response, Renee brings a wealth of experience to our conversation. She's a UN Alliance of Civilizations Fellow and the Google Impact Award winner. In this episode, Renee shares insights on how technology can be a double-edged sword. With the power to both create and solve social challenges, we'll dive into her thoughts and importance of building responsible tech ecosystems and fostering digital rights, and also explore her vision for creating a future where technology truly serves society. Renee's journey from PeaceGeeks to GoodBot reveals the depth of her commitment to making technology a force for good. Join us as we discuss the complexities of digital rights, the fight against discrimination, and the need for community collaboration to drive meaningful change in the tech landscape. Let's get started. Okay, well, welcome everybody again. We have today Renee Black joining us, and Alex, why don't you just get started?
Sure, and thank you, Renee, for joining us today. We usually start by asking people who join our podcast about their journey and how they landed with the focus that they have now. Your journey into AI and governance and technology is really deeply, or seems really deeply rooted in desire to address power imbalances and ensure that technology really benefits all. Can you really talk us through how your background from PeaceGeeks and transitioning into GoodBot came about?
Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here with you both. My journey with GoodBot is a bit of a different one, I think, than many people who come into this space. My time at PeaceGeeks focused on working in communities that had been affected by armed conflict. And we were looking at the way technologies and platforms could play an active role in peace building, but also the roles that they were playing in contributing to and exacerbating conflicts that were happening on the ground. And a conclusion that I took away from my 10 years working in the space was that the failure to govern these platforms was introducing complexities that were making conflict-affected situations very vulnerable, and that there's a need to deal with these and other types of vulnerable situations so that the benefits that we can see from technology and from these advancements in AI can be beneficial in a broader sense. But the way that they're designed right now, there's a lot of people who end up being affected, especially on the margins, in ways that are very untransparently dealt with and unaccountably responded to. GoodBot's really been focused on how do we think through what more responsible technology ecosystems can look like and what the future looks like when that happens.
I took a time to obviously look into the work you've done, and I watched some of your presentations and videos with PeaceGeeks and check out all the website. And I just want to say that it's really good work, and I think especially if you identify, because I am an immigrant and I've come to Canada from Peru at the time where there was a civil war conflict. And so I experienced, the what is it like to be in a country where there's political and potential civil unrest and things like that. So it's just to think of that there was an organization that thinks about reaching how technology can help. It's really commendable. I just want to say that is really really good work that you've done, and you continue to do now with GoodBot. My question or reflection that I would ask you is, because I tend to ask the same question to all the guests, given the explosion of artificial intelligence in the last couple of years, what are some of the things that from the work you have done in the past and then the work that you're doing now, you think is that makes it different or in some way allow you to think of the work that you've been doing in the way that maybe we need to look at it? Because it's,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the the explosion of AI and social media platforms before it has sort of come out of, I mean, I was going to say nowhere, but it's actually not nowhere. There's a lot of actually big decisions that have contributed to the rise of these platforms that have enabled them to grow and to attain the mass and reach and power that they have today. So, and I think, if we think back to the early days of social media in the Arab Spring, it was really seen in a very positive light, a tool that was going to be democratizing, helping to kind of unshackle some of the conversations that were happening in different countries around the world. But almost as quickly as you started to see that, you also started to see some of the more concerning ways that platforms could be manipulated by governments in Iran in the Green Revolution around that time. You saw surveillance happening that ended up impacting a lot of people who were in the streets protesting. And you saw a lot of ways in which the narratives that were starting to happen in digital spaces were being weaponized in different ways. So, so AI is kind of in the next step in this, and of course, the AI is, we have not dealt with all of the social media problems, and now we are introducing AI platforms that are compounding what we have in social media. So we already have lots of disinformation. We already have lots of scams. We already have lots of big issues around polarization that occur in social media right now as it is. And on top of that, we are adding some fuel to the fire in the form of generative AI platforms that are able to produce some of that at scale. And, there's an inherent asymmetry that occurs when you're dealing with some of this information, because people who are, for example, in the journalism space have a need to produce fact-checked information. But if you're trying to spread disinformation, you don't have that same need. You only need to produce enough content that will reach a small number of people. And it doesn't matter at all if any of it's accurate. And in fact, the point is that it's not. And I think that another point that we are seeing is like this intentionality around sowing chaos and confusion among a broader electorate that makes it very hard to feel like you have a voice in a civic conversation, and to make it to make you feel like there's something you can do. And so those, I think, are really big challenges that are being compounded by AI right now. And I do see opportunities to make that better, but we're nowhere close to that right now.
I want to focus a little bit later on. I want to dive in deeper into a project that you're holding around the deception economy. But before that, I want to talk about both your previous work has obviously dealt with fairly dramatic and difficult topics related to armed conflict, and as we're looking at discussions around AI, where it's being used with military application, with the deception economy, these are complex and really, really harmful uses of an incredibly powerful technology. We are having conversation around where we're trying to get a sector and communities that aren't part of the conversation yet into the conversation. And a lot of the conversation that we're having is how can we have the conversations around really harmful uses like military application or the deception economy without preventing that conversation from having people shut down and not want to participate. So really killing the imagination of beneficial uses, for instance. So how do you mitigate that? Because obviously you are historically you've been tackling one, and you're still focused on deception economy, but you're also exploring positive use cases. So I just wonder how you would tackle that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to actually understand the role of the narratives that are coming out of the sector in this conversation. Because one of the challenges that we deal with is this sense of that all of this technology is inevitable. It's a false binary. You need to get on board or be left behind. You need to, US needs to win the war or it's going to lose it to China. And there's these false binaries that basically kind of are, designed in a way to prevent something in between, which is a responsible version of what AI looks like. And so I think that is a very big challenge, because it means that you end up, removing some of the spaces to actually think through what it looks like when this is done intentionally. The sort of Silicon Valley model of, uh, you know, iterate fast and break things, I mean, is fine perhaps when you're designing a small, application that's going to reach a few hundred people. But when you're designing applications that are going to have an impact and reach around the world, you can break democracy, you can break countries, you can break social structures that sort of hold people together. And so, and there's really been no intentionality around thinking about what these harms are in a proactive way from the beginning when these platforms are designed. I mean, if you think back to when Facebook, for example, was designed, I mean, Facebook was designed in its initial iteration as an app to compare girls. So that's not exactly a socially sort of beneficial application. And it kind of grew from there. And, it's incentivized by the needs of venture capitalists that are in Silicon Valley who are trying to get the scale and the reach and who aren't looking for the kind of safety issues that would be important to kind of making sure that these things work safely at scale. So I think that those are some of the things that I think about when it comes to AI. We're in a different place because, of course, a lot of people have been watching what's happened on the platform side and understanding that that can't be the reality. And so trying to think through what does proactive, AI assessments look like? What does it look like to have a value chain where you can assess, both the hardware, the software, the data sets along that value chain so that you are getting to better places. But there's still not, for all the conversation that is happening around ethical AI, the extent to which it is being operationalized within companies is still very, opaque at best and probably non-existent in many cases. And so I think that is a big concern. And we see the outcomes of that, and we see there's a lot of AI fails, and the result of these AI fails is that it actually leads consumers and the public to actually have very big concerns and to reduce their trust in these tools. So I actually believe personally that it's in the best interest of AI companies and people who want to develop apps on large language models to start to build that trust as a way to make sure that they have a sustainable future.
I was when I was reading like what and understanding what is GoodBot and also went over social media, it was very clear to me that we very much align in terms of like the idea of having an interdisciplinary approach to understanding the technologies that we are dealing with. And I know from the work that we do with Alex and the Managed Technology Fellowship, we always talk about how we need to build an ecosystem. And we need to really have a sense of collaboration and people working together. And then we have things like the tech stewardship and AI stewardship that puts us in the context of coming together and then be holding our hands together. But also, can you talk about like from your perspective, how do you see the need to, or how do you see, or why is it that we need to have this idea of communities of practice? Coming together, collaboration. How do you see the necessity to be able to do that kind of work in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because some of the work that we did with PeaceGeeks was looking at immigration-related innovation, and I see a similar problem in this space as I saw there, which is that there's not a baseline capacity to understand technology in a broader sense and the role it plays within the processes that we work in. And so I think that when you think about in the nonprofit ecosystem, there's people with very different understandings of what the problem is. So I think one of the challenges that I see is there's been historically far too much focus on the symptoms. How do we help people to identify what disinformation looks like? And of course, that is really important right now because there's so much of it out there that we need to do that. I guess one of the questions but there's also problems on the economic side of it, because disinformation is also incentivized in certain ways. Polarization is incentivized by engagement-based algorithms on platforms. So how do you start to deal with the incentive structures that kind of end up encouraging that kind of behavior in that type of a context? I think when it comes to, sorry, I just realized that I've lost the track of the question. What was the question again?
That's basically why is collaboration and working within a community to be lining us up with as many people as possible. Why might that be more important now than maybe even before?
Yeah, so I mean, I think because there are systems level issues that are happening within the technology sort of spaces that we occupy, it's important to understand whether or not your initiative is at what level it's operating, and then how it interacts with other people who are working across that sort of value chain. So if you're working on awareness raising, that's fine, but then can you also make sure that you're interacting and learning from the people who are thinking about the business models, and then learning also from people who are thinking about competition issues and so on. So there's, we need to think in systems and understand where we are in systems so that we can have an effective and coordinated community response.
So when I started, let's say my early recent journey with generative AI, and I was just coming across, who's holding the power, and looking at the companies that most valuable companies in the world, which is if you look at top 5, there's probably at least 2 to 3 companies that are in some way touching on AI developments, like Nvidia and Microsoft, for example. And one of the things that I don't say struggle, but I came across is just it being such a significant change in the power dynamics. I used to tend to focus a little bit on the let's say the doomsday types of scenario, and one of the people that, as you very well know, talks about that kind of stuff is Geoffrey Hinton, who just won the Nobel Prize of Physics for his contributions on artificial neurons, which is, one of the contribution to the reason why AI is so big right now. Do you get, when talking about things like, war conflicts, or things that are maybe a little bit, maybe for some people, maybe bigger, a bigger scope. Do you get any sort of experience or pushback or arguments this is so big, or any kind of pushback or any kind of comments about people just maybe telling you this is big of a scope, too big of a scope, something like that?
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if I hear people saying that it's too big. Sure, hear people saying that, absolutely. And I also see people doing something about that. There's quite a lot of focus right now on the antitrust and competition side of this conversation. There's a landmark case against Google not long ago regarding search. And that was quite interesting because, with search, it's not a transaction. You're not paying for a service, at least with money, you're paying with your data. And so that's quite a big that's quite a big ruling that will have some implications for others. Of course, the advertising model is also going through for Google at this moment in time. And I think that there is a lot more attention on the value chain. And you're absolutely right. As you go further down the tech stack, the higher the concentration is. And that type of concentration is dangerous, because anytime there's that much power, there tends to be a corresponding lack of accountability. And it's important to note that how we got here again has been through some intentional policies. Apple getting in the door for its own platforms was a product of basically hacking interoperability with Microsoft so that it could basically compete. And then having done that, it basically found a way to lock the door behind it so that nobody could do the same thing. And so companies have created these walled gardens that make it very difficult for other people to compete with them. That's an intentional policy that has created this crisis of competition that we're in right now. And that competition ends up resulting in these large companies, a lot of unaccountability, and a whole bunch of harms that happen as a result of that. And so that's not a good outcome for markets. It's not a good outcome for consumers, and it's not a good outcome for democracies, because it becomes harder and harder to hold those companies accountable. And when you're a smaller country like Canada, and we call this the secondary market economy effect, there's a challenge because Canada doesn't have the power of a collective group like the EU to kind of help push it towards an AI Act. It keeps on getting picked off by big tech companies with the policies that are happening. And so I suppose on the other side of that, there's a lot of other countries that are in the secondary market economy situation. So how can you collect the power of these secondary markets to help try to bridge some solutions that are not just really reinforcing U.S. Kind of policy, but really trying to find solutions that are grounded in sort of local mores that are more locally salient and relevant. And I think that is sort of another point I want to raise. We've seen this sort of exportation and colonization of different types of policies in different ways. Historically, it's been through actual colonization, but during peace processes, we saw that in the form of policies. If you look back to somewhere like Rwanda, the free speech policy, has merits and drawbacks, but it also created the conditions in which a genocide occurred. So I think it's important to understand that there is an exportation of policy via technology that is happening right now, and that is affecting everybody. And so I think on the one hand, we want to try to have some sort of sense of coherence. And on the other hand, we also want to be able to also maintain some distinguished identities, sovereign identities for the places that we live in. We don't want to just become byproducts and secondary thoughts to the United States sort of, project.
And just we've talked about power dynamics and the power of technology in terms of developing and having a seat at the table and so forth. But I want to relate that to you have a focus on the deception economy and disinformation, and obviously are exploring how do we deal with that. I just recently, and I'm not a blockchain expert by any means, but right now there's an initiative led by Sam Altman, who heads OpenAI, around WorldCoin that's now been relabeled as World ID or World, as a response to the need for drilling down who's human, so to combat disinformation and deception economy and so forth, which looks on the onset good. Like we need to have tools and methodologies to deal with that. However, when you look at the approach that they're taking to do so, they've developed this orb that scans biometrics for people. And I thought, okay, that's something that'll take longer. And so I was surprised that 4.5 million people, including 300,000 people in Portugal, including minors, have had their biometrics scanned. Which, if you look at the history of that type of data and what that's done to marginalized communities, and to be able to track and then what you're talking about, what happened in Rwanda and so forth, there's been instances where that type of biometrics have been collected and then used later on for purposes that were non-intended. As you're holding topics and projects around deception economy and disinformation, how do we make sure that we don't fall into the same people who are holding the power around developing technology, also holding the knee-jerk in being able to respond in ways that have incredibly harmful, often unintended consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this sort of, is talking to like a bigger market sort of issue, which is that companies are trying to be everything. They're validating identities, their AI models, their social media platforms, and they're doing they're sort of infrastructure sort of developers. That's a big challenge, because then you end up having so many parts of the value chain, and then within those value chains you have conflicts of interest. One of the things around this Google case for the advertising is the fact that Google, in addition to being a broker within the advertising space, is also owns ad space and also has ads that they want to sell, and has places along that value chain in which they benefit by prioritizing their services. And that is something that no other person in that value chain can compete with. So they're both a broker as well as a player within that brokerage, and that is a clear conflict of interest. So these types of marketplace dynamics have also played out in Amazon, some of the antitrust cases there. And so, I think a big issue is how do we start to kind of break apart these different companies that are trying to share across information across all these different domains where they dominate. I think that the identity verification piece should really just be an identity verification model. If you are into that space, your job is to verify if somebody exists, or if they are a certain age, or if they are a resident of a certain country, and that's it. It's not to share these demographics that are going to end up marginalizing somebody. We don't have right now any type of it's a very loose process that happens between tech companies and governments. But what we used to have, if you wanted to investigate somebody, is subpoenas. And you had a way to kind of go and tap, a subpoena for a wiretap to kind of check some things. You don't, there's a much more fluid engagement between governments and platforms right now. in ways that I think end up, again, sort of impacting marginalized communities. I'm curious what processes look like when they're accountable, where you have to go through some sort of rigor so that you're not having this kind of constant flow of information in ways that end up harming the people who are already most marginalized.
And just for going further along on that, you've done some work and you've even created curriculums around thinking and system exploring how you got to this point, looking at technology and really thinking through where do we go from here, given the fact that these are complex systems that AI is permeating, and even in other systems that aren't as complex, humans and our societies aren't great at looking at interconnections of systems. How, given your work there, and feel free to talk about your curriculum, how you approach it, how do you want to invite people thinking about it that's usually siloed?
So this was a problem for me when I was starting out. I'd spent 10 years running PeaceGeeks. I was, getting quite familiar with the issues that were kind of within my domain as somebody who worked on peace, but also on immigration and settlement issues in Canada. But I could also see all of the other areas that were kind of coming up and arising. And so harms against children has been a big theme in the last couple of years. But there's also issues around privacy. There's also issues around seniors. There's also issues around minorities and so on. And so looking at all of the different harms and how complex any one of these spaces was overwhelming. And then understanding kind of the layers at which that people are trying to think about those problems was also hard. And I think that when you think about that overwhelm, it can feel paralyzing. It can make you feel like, why there's nothing I can do, and I'm just gonna go kayaking because it's just like, or whatever you do, and go do art, because it can feel feel overwhelming, and like you have nothing that you can do. And I would argue that that is by design. I think that there is an intentionality around this, trying to create the sense of powerlessness, and that's probably controversial. But I think that if you give in to this narrative, then there's not enough pushback, and then it does become inevitable. And so I think that part of what we've been trying to do is help to understand what the systems look like, and so help people to see where they are or aren't in the system, and then also help to see who else is in the system that is doing really kick-ass work. Because if you can see that, and then you can start to feel like the piece that you're taking on is useful. And you can also learn from what other people are doing and how they're trying to think through what leverage in systems looks like. Because not every intervention is going to have the same impact. So how do you learn from people who are thinking very strategically about where impact can occur? There's lots of great resources and lessons to be learned from what is already happening. And I think that another part is those voices don't get nearly enough attention right now. We hear so much. When you hear news coverage around tech, nonprofits are not covered. I mean, so once in a while you get academics covered, but nonprofits are not, and citizens are not. And so there's this disproportionate representation of voices. And academics can also be part of the problem, because some of them have been in industry and are echoing an industry narrative intentionally or unintentionally. So we're not getting a representative voice in some of these conversations that are really needed to make sure that we are getting towards a more public interest and humane space.
Yes, totally. We shake our heads, proving that comment about like how nonprofits and philanthropies are just not part of a much needed conversation, and we need them. So many things I could ask you, but we almost have about 2 more questions to go, and we need to wrap up. So what I wanted to ask is, given the work that you have been doing, what is one thing, or if you want to share more than one thing that you are very excited about, that when it comes to the future, that you are looking to do something about or work towards, in any like long-term vision about the direction in which your work is heading?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, the curriculum that we're working on, I've been able to showcase it for a few people, and I've done a version of it for my 6-year-old niece, and I was really surprised how much she actually was able to understand some of the ideas. And so that was kind of exciting. I think people kind of get this is important, and even though they come at it from different levels of experience and understanding, there's sort of an understanding that there's a there. And so, I think that that's great. And I do actually think it's important to try to have these conversations earlier than later, because I think if you can see these ideas early on, then you can prevent some of the harms that happen later on. In the disinformation space, they call that pre-bunking. You try to show somebody what's going to happen before it actually happens so that they are less susceptible to some of the narratives and mechanisms of social engineering. So I would say, the curriculum is something we're really excited about. We have a project that's also called the Unrepresented. So part of what we're looking at here is the way that AI models have been trained non-consensually on data that's on platforms, including by artists and creators and other groups, and trying to understand what mechanisms, both in terms of technology solutions or policies, could be created to try to allow people to protect the data that they have created and that they have ownership over, but that who do not have legal representation and don't have the resources to go and sue a company. And so, because the challenge is, if we don't have an answer to this problem, there is a very real risk that this will happen in perpetuity. There's the data that has been collected up until now, but there's now also the data that will be collected in the future. And this is really important for people here, but it's actually really important for the global majority, because all of their data is being taken up if it's in public spaces as well. And there's not nearly enough training that's been done on, non-English data, not the same level, but that is coming. And so I think as that future kind of approaches, it's going to be incumbent and, I think the benefit of global majority countries to be thinking through those options as well.
Yes, what was that thing that you shared with your niece? You said that from the curriculum that resonated with her.
We were talking about how, so one of her sisters had gotten a mobile phone, her first mobile phone. She was 11, and so she was really excited. She was on it all the time. And they also have another sister who's 9, and the 9-year-old sister really wants her own phone as well. And so we talked about how people use phones, what they're excited to do. And then I started to get into what are some things that might happen that are, what do they think happens on a phone? What do they think happens on a social media app? What do they think happens on a game? Unfortunately, I was able to point to some things that I had seen myself. There was one ad that had popped up in a game that they had been playing, and it was using a dark pattern. So I was able to talk about this concept of dark patterns, although actually I prefer the term deceptive patterns, because of the kind of notion and association with dark. So the deceptive pattern was intentionally designed to get you to click on something that looked like a close button, but actually opened up another window. And that brought you to a game that had a cop and a woman who looked like a sex worker, and another woman who were fighting over the cop, and one with the makeup dripping down her face. And it was just a terrible sort of misogynist kind of depiction that was being presented to my 6-year-old niece. And so I was able to use that example to talk to her about what deception looks like, what people are trying to get you to do, what are the stories that narratives are trying to tell you that are not really aligned with what you want for yourself. And how do we kind of make sure that we're thinking pretty intentionally about what we want from the technology that we have, so that we're driving technology and it's not driving us.
And I love that you shared that conversation, because it's actually a way, and this is actually not necessarily only an age thing. It's as we're exploring how to learn concepts, but also how to talk about and explain concepts. I often use, I don't know if you know the Wired magazines, like 5 levels of difficulty, from like childhood to high school to undergrad, grad, and expert. I find that really useful, both to learn, but also how we're talking about these concepts, and it needs to be discussed at all ages.
Yeah.
I want to finish off by asking you, how do like our audience and people at large get involved in tangible and practical ways in some of your projects, like the deception economy, like the underrepresented? And often, and I'm gonna highlight that I love the fact that you shared with me that you do stand-up comedy and really step outside of your comfort zone, especially in a space where this is stepping outside the comfort zone for a lot of the people in nonprofits and philanthropy. They don't do tech, and especially when we're looking at AI, it's something completely new. It's scary. It's sometimes extremely harmful what we're looking at. How do you intentionally step outside of our comfort zone in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna maybe try to answer that in two parts. One is that I actually think that the value of comedy and narratives can play a really important role in this. My dream actually is to create a comedy series that would be some combination of like The Good Place and Silicon Valley, and something along that line. That would sort of marry this idea of ethics into this conversation. And then really be an intentional space for thinking about the systems level of things that happen in Silicon Valley and the impact that it has globally. I think that comedy can be a really powerful way to reach people and educate people. And to kind of, you don't have to, your brain kind of doesn't shut down the same way that it does when you're consuming something that feels serious. So I have a real desire there to do something along that line. I think that back to your other question of how people can get involved. I mean, I think that so a lot of what we have right now is research working groups, and so we have these groups going on. One's focused on this unrepresented, the deception economy. We also have one that's focused on big tech lobbying in Canada. And we are also curious about this deceptive marketing and deceptive practices that's kind of really under the competition side. So what does it look like when a deceptive practice can become something that is sort of getting into this legal space? I would also say that interoperability, although not a project theme that we're focusing on, is just such a crucial issue in this conversation about competition that we'd love to kind of get into ourselves. I mean, I think that the other part that we're working on, and Alex, you're familiar with this, is we're interested in, we were trying to get this responsible tech repository for Canada out. We've collected data on nonprofits, and obviously we want to try to figure out how to, sync on the data that you've collected as well. And we've collected data on litigation, on sort of some of the policies across Canada, including at the provincial and municipal level. And I think that we really want to see some of these conversations being mainstreamed in a way that they become accessible, because this overwhelm is a very big issue. And I think it is important to actually develop the tech policy literacy capacities of nonprofits in a way so that they feel empowered to engage in these conversations, that they feel that they have language, that they have frameworks, and that they have, a certain level of knowledge and expertise that allows them to engage without feeling completely overwhelmed. And so I hope that we can play a little bit of a role in shepherding that future forward, because I think that the more people that are involved in thinking through how to both develop and govern and oversee these technologies, the better that the platforms can get. And the more people that can get involved in the development of platforms as well, because I think that is, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around the size. A lot of the best models have been small and very intentionally trained on a very narrow set. So there's brilliant applications that can happen in that size. So how do we also kind of start to surface those opportunities as well?
Two comments just to close off. Number one is just going back to the example of your niece. I have also a niece that's 12 years old, and she is also very curious, and actually, I think she used ChatGPT to do some some early assignment that she did. I didn't walk her through this, but she just did it on her own. But we had here on episode number 2 of the podcast, Riz Basir, and we were talking with him how important it is to be a guide more to the generations that are growing with these technologies.
Yeah.
Because now we, not to age myself, but like in the pre-internet era, there's some of us who were aware of what was the world like before the internet and then after the internet. And like now, we are sort of like at the space where like we know what the world was pre-Gen AI and after Gen AI. And then, the newer generations are sort of like just growing into it. And then the second comment is, if you were to just create like a AI comedy stand-up special, I think you'll get very good traction. So I would totally support that, and like a Netflix special or something like that.
I would totally come to it.
Yeah. So we just add time, because also we don't want to overextend the uses of your voice. You've been so kind to join us despite of that. Is there anything that you would like to share with our audience who are people and organizations in the social impact space? Anything that just we haven't talked about, anything at all that you would like to say, anything about a GoodBot or anything that you would like to share?
I guess I would just like to say wherever you are is the right place, and use that as your starting place to join and come at it with a place of healthy skepticism and curiosity. I think that the important thing is to kind of start the journey, and try to make sure you're asking good questions along the way, so that you can be useful within your organization, and that you can feel like you can make a contribution to the bigger communities. I think it is overwhelming, and don't let that stop you. I think that everybody's voice is needed.
Well, and I thank you once again, Renee, for joining us, for having this lively conversation. And I think there were so many things I wanted to ask. Like, for example, you talk about colonization and how that takes place into AI work, and I wanted to ask, but we don't have time, so probably have you again after another episode. We'll share links to the initiatives and work that you're doing. And I'm just gonna thank Alex also and the audience for listening. And yeah, thank you. Share, like, and comment about this content. Thank you. Until next time.